class, Prof JC, and I'm looking forward to these video podcasts that we'll do. We'll do these pretty much every week, and what I'm going to do is just cover different chapters in our book here, difficult conversations, how to discuss what matters most. If you've been in leadership any amount of time, then you know that these difficult conversations also, sometimes they're called, there's another word for it, kind of a tough conversation, or I don't know what the other word for it is, but these difficult conversations are incredibly important for your growth, for the growth of other people, for the growth of the organization. There's a video that we watch, and in that video it talks about the organization as communication. And you know, I remember when I first thought about that, I thought the organization as communication, I thought that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Communication is a part of the organization, but it's not the full thing. But then the older I've gotten, the more mature I've become, and the more experience I've had, I think it's true. I think everything in the organization, it comes back to this idea of communication. And everything else outside of that, if you think about it, it's walls, it's paper, it's policy, it's structure, it's all of that kind of stuff, but it's not necessarily the movement of ideas, the innovation, the creativity. All of that is through communication. And the hard conversations that we have, the difficult conversations that we have, when we're trying to move an organization forward and something's not right within the organization, it all comes back to communication. So difficult conversations are a part of it. They're a part of teams, they're a part of families, they're a part of organizations. They're just a part. So chapter 1, and what these podcasts are pretty much going to be the next few weeks, I'm just going to walk through these chapters and pick out what I think is most important. I'm going to ask you to write about that. Sometimes I put all the questions that I'm going to have you write on at the end of the video. Sometimes I sprinkle them throughout. So just make sure you watch the video. I'm going to do my best to make these as short as possible, but I want to make sure that we get to the key points. So in chapter 1 of this book, it talks about the fact that each difficult conversation really is 3 conversations. And so number 1, that difficult conversation is the what happened conversation, right? And here's what the book has to say. It says, most difficult conversations involve disagreement about what happened or what should happen. Who said what and who did what, who's right, who meant that, who's to blame, all this kind of stuff. That's part of it. Okay. That's part of the conversation, is getting down to the, to the brass tacks, what happened. The second thing that the conversation is, the second conversation that one conversation is the feelings conversation. Here's what the book says. The book says, every difficult conversation also asks and answers questions about feelings. Are my feelings valid? Are my feelings appropriate? Should I acknowledge or deny them, put them on the table or check them at the door? What should I do with the other person's feelings? Feelings are a part of it. I do a lot of training outside, kind of outside consulting and training. And one of the things that we talk about is it's so important for leaders to understand, when we're making decisions in organizations, we're making these decisions with emotional beings. Right now, and I hope for the rest of all time, human beings are the number one being on planet Earth. Right now, with the onslaught of AI, there's a lot of talk that AI is going to take over all this and human beings aren't going to have a role. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope human beings always sit at the top. But the issue with human beings is that we are emotional beings. And this is why they say one of the positive aspects of AI is going to be organizations that run smoothly, because you have these robots that can run 24/7 almost, and they don't have the same emotions. They don't have the ups and downs. They don't call in sick, all this kind of stuff. They don't, if you give it feedback, right, it's just data. It doesn't run off and cry in the bathroom for 15 minutes and need to take a day off and a mental health day and all this kind of stuff. It just does the work. Well, human beings aren't the same way. Human beings are beings. So when we're having a difficult conversation, we have to understand we're having that conversation with an emotional being. And so that's just the way it is. And if you're one of these people that doesn't like that, well, yeah, you're going to have to get over that. That's part of leadership, is understanding that we are interacting with emotional beings. We are emotional beings. You may not be as emotionally expressive as the next person, but you are an emotional being as well. And then the third conversation that the difficult conversation is, it's the identity conversation. This is the conversation we each have with ourselves about what the situation means to us. We conduct an internal debate about whether this means we are competent or incompetent, a good person or bad person, worthy of love or unlovable. What impact might it have on our self-image and self-esteem, our future, and our well-being, right? All of these questions are questions that we're asking that come back to us, okay? If we get feedback, if someone's having a difficult conversation with us and they're giving us tough feedback, if we're not careful, we take that feedback personally. And we say, well, because I didn't do well in my job today, I'm not a good person. And we know that that's not true, right? At the conscious level, we know that that's not true, and we can talk about that now. But when you're in the middle of a difficult conversation, especially if it's coming your way, you may be thinking that this has something to do with me. So it's important for us to, from a leadership perspective, and this is a leadership course, it's important for us to think about it when we're sitting with someone and having a difficult conversation. Even though they're not thinking it, we know that this is what's happening right now. It's the what happened conversation. It's the feelings conversation. It's the identity conversation. So here's the first assignment, first part of the assignment that I want you to do. I guess it's the first question that I want you to answer for our podcast this week. I want you to break down a recent difficult conversation that you had, recently in the last few months, maybe last few weeks. You don't have to write out the whole conversation, but break down what you remember of the conversation and how it was these three conversations rolled up into one. What part of the conversation was the what happened conversation? What part of the conversation was the feelings conversation? And what part of the conversation was the identity conversation? And looking back on all of that now, is there anything that you would do better? Okay. So that's the first question that I want you to answer. Okay. Do all that, find a conversation, break that down into those three parts, and then figure out what could you have done better in that conversation. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is entitled Stop Arguing About Who's Right, Explore Each Other's Stories. I want to talk just briefly about a principle that I didn't come up with. This principle. It was written about by a gentleman. His name is Stephen Covey. And if you haven't read his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I recommend you get that book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's on Amazon. It's anywhere you get your books. It is one of the leadership gold standards, and I recommend that you get this book. In this book, he talks about this idea of seeking first to understand. So many times when we come to a conversation, especially a difficult conversation, we want the other person to understand us first. So we sit down and we start telling our side of it and why we think this and why we're here and what's important and what we feel. And then we say, now tell me what you think about it. And what we don't begin with, what we don't understand, is their perspective, their point of view. Leadership is always, it's a tough, I call it a calling. If a person seeks to be in leadership, it's a calling that they're pursuing, and it's something that we never should take lightly. And so the hard part about it is when we're having difficult conversations, one of the most important things, we have to sit down and we've got to listen to the other person, listen to their side of the story, and to figure out what happened from their perspective first before we jump in, right? I think that this should be a leadership standard no matter what. When we go into team meetings, when we're leading the team, as opposed to going in, I've seen a lot of leaders do this. They go in and they say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's the work that we need to get done. Here are the steps that we're going to take. What do you all think? And obviously, because it's the boss, they're all you go around the table and everyone nods their head and said, "Oh, yes, boss. That's a great idea. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss." And the boss gets up and walks out, and he walks out of the meeting and says, "I'm brilliant." And he doesn't realize that everybody in that meeting just went out to the water cooler. Everybody in that meeting just went out to lunch together, and they're all talking about how bad the how bad the plan is going to be, how bad the project's going to be, because the leader came in and he wanted to be understood first. It was all about him or her versus saying, hey, I need to figure out what the problem is. I need to get all of your input, and then we'll understand the problem better. That's what this chapter 2 is talking about, and it gives different strategies in here. We think they are the problem, right? So when we come to a conversation, if we're not careful, we begin thinking these kind of things. They're the problem. They're naive. They're controlling. They're irrational. Now, I want you to think about this as well. It's not just from a leadership perspective. It could be the next time you're in a room with your boss and your boss is trying to relay something to you. And maybe you've got to step back and look at, what am I coming to the table with? Do I really understand this person? Years ago, I worked for a gentleman, and to say that I hated this person probably wouldn't. That's probably not an exaggeration. Now, I don't hate this person anymore. As a matter of fact, we're very good friends. I had to do work on myself, but for 3 years when I worked for this person, I worked for them for 8 years total. But for 3 of those years, I hated this person. And it was doing more to me than it did to that person. That's kind of how it works. But as I did my own personal work and figured out why I'm struggling in this relationship, because he wasn't going to change. He didn't need to change. He was the boss. I was the one, if I was going to stay in the organization, needed to change. And once I started figuring it out, and I started getting better, and I started growing up and being more mature in the situation and coming into meetings and saying, how about I try to understand him first, instead of trying to jump in and try to give my point of view and why it's so important. And this guy had built the organization from nothing. He'd been there 30 years. I'm coming in with 6 months time in service, 8 months, 2 years. And I'm wanting him to listen to me. And I'm not understanding that, I need to understand his perspective first. He's the one who's been around a long time. Everything got better once I started to do that. Okay. And the same will go for you. So it's not just from leadership, how we do this with other people. It's also when maybe we have a tough conversation with our boss. Okay. Here's some other things it talks about why we each see the world differently. Because we do. That's why conversations are tough, and that's why workplaces are tough, because you got all these different people who've got all these different perspectives coming into the workplace. They see things differently. And why does it happen? Because we all have different information. And it talks in there that we notice different things. We know ourselves better than anyone else can. We have different interpretations on certain things. This year is election year, right? And if you watch the debate, last week, that's all the news. I'm a political junkie. I love politics. And so it's all I watch, and especially after the debate and all the stuff going on around about that. But in a political year like this year, if this is where we're going to see people kind of divide themselves, are you red or are you blue, right? Are you independent, right? And sometimes, and I've heard people say this before, how in the world can you see the world the way you do? How can you vote the way you do? How can you believe it? Well, it's because they have a different interpretation of events, okay? And if we're not careful, we begin to label them and say, well, they're a bad person because they believe different. No, that's not that. It's that they grew up differently. They have a different way of looking at the situation, right? On page 36 here, it talks about this. Our conclusions reflect self-interest. Now, this one is really important. We got to understand this. Most people, everybody, I would say, is 100% of the time working in their own self-interest. Everybody at every minute of the day is working with their own self-interest. This is called human nature. It's just how human beings work. And if you don't think that, I want you to think about your own life. And you say, well, no, that's not true, JC. You're saying that maybe you're projecting who you are onto me. I don't do that. I think about my family. Well, why do you think about your family? Probably something about that makes you feel good about yourself. Something about giving to the people that you give to. Maybe for those of you who are, the Mother Teresa's in the class, there's something about that makes you feel good, or you wouldn't do it. Human nature is always working in self-interest. It's why we have to take leadership courses, and it's why I do trainings with companies and we work on soft skills, because human beings aren't naturally wired for soft skills, right? If you've ever watched a 2 or 3-year-old play, you know that that's pretty much how human beings are wired. human beings have to learn over time how to cooperate with other people, how to collaborate with other people, how to grow in their soft skills, their understandings, how, in some ways, how to be the person that they're not. Okay. And so it's really important as human beings, what we want to do is we want to come into a situation and we want to share our own side of the story. It's survival. I want you to get me. I want you to understand why I made the decision I made, or why I said this thing I said, or why I did that. Because I need you to understand me. That's survival. We all do it. On page 40, it's got this great statement here. It says this. It's in the first paragraph. The mere act of understanding someone else's story doesn't require you to give up your own. The and stance, if you want to know more about the and stance, okay, read this in your book. The and stance allows you to recognize that how you each see things matters, that how you feel, that how each of you feels matters, right? That's the and stance. Me and you and me. Regardless of what you end up doing, regardless of whether your story influences theirs or yours, both stories matters. And I think that's important for us when we come into difficult conversations, to say that, hey, they may have a different perspective, but it doesn't mean that mine is wrong. It doesn't mean that their perspective is wrong. It's perspective. It's human nature. We're all working out of human nature. So here's the second question that I want you to ask, or I want you to reflect on and just kind of write up. Why do most people, okay, seek to be understood first, then to understand the other person? Again, what we're saying is kind of countercultural. I'm asking you to seek first to understand the other person and then to be understood. Why do most people, why do you, okay, I want you to reflect on you. Don't think about other people. So I should have asked that better. Why do you, okay, typically, why is your human nature wired so much that you want to be understood first before understanding the other person? I want you to write about that. Third chapter, and this one's important. I'll make this one quick. Third chapter says this: don't assume they meant it. Disentangle intent from impact. If we're not careful, we come into all of our difficult conversations and we come into it and we assume bad intentions, okay? And what it talks about here on page 48 is that getting their intentions wrong is costly. So we have to be very careful that we stay out of motives. I was listening. I told you I'm a news junkie. I listen to politics all the time, and there's a lot happening in the news right now. And so I was listening recently. The Supreme Court just made I would call it a landmark decision. I don't know if it was a landmark or not, but it definitely is a consequential decision. And one of the things that one of the judges wrote in their there's a certain word for it, but it's I'll call it their report. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was one of the ones who went in favor of the court's ruling. And one of the things they talked about is we have to be careful as a court about getting into the motives of a person. And maybe in this particular instance, it was the motives of the U.S. president. And I would say, just in general, we have to be careful about assuming the motives or the intents of other people. I've done this many times, right? Something small where your boss may say, hey, I need to see you at 4:00 in my office, today. And we automatically go to the worst case scenario, right? It's human nature. It's what human natures do. It's what humans do. It's what human nature does. And I could talk a lot about this and maybe one of our podcasts will actually talk about this, because human beings, from an evolutionary perspective, our minds have been evolving over thousands and thousands of years. And we still think, oftentimes our brain still thinks it's out there with the lions, tigers, and the bears. And so it's constantly looking for worst case scenarios. So your boss says, I need to talk to you at 4:00 in my office today. Our mind automatically goes, we begin to assume their intent. We begin to assume their motives. And then you walk in and they're like, hey, I just wanted to check in on you, see how everything's going. The project you turned in the other day was incredible. You did a great job on it. I just wanted to have a chance to tell you that. And we walk out of there and our whole day was ruined because we're assuming intent, okay? We're assuming the motives. Maybe we have someone on our team that is showing up late. Maybe they didn't show up late before, but they're starting to show up late. And so we begin to assume negative intent, and we don't know the whole story. And so that's what it talks about here is, getting the intentions of the other person wrong is costly. If we're not careful, we assume bad intentions mean bad character. Accusing them of bad intentions creates defensiveness. So if we go into a meeting or a difficult conversation and we already think that they have bad motives, we automatically get defensive. Okay. And then we find ourselves tensed up in a defensive stance. Okay. Attributions can become self-fulfilling. That's what the book says. And I believe this, that if we're not careful, we can put things out there and it really becomes true. Right. And so we find ourselves actually having to be in a defensive stance because we've put things out that our assumptions come true about the other person. So we have to be very careful with this. Okay. It also talks about here, good intentions don't sanitize bad impact. So sometimes there are things that go wrong and they were done with good intentions, but it doesn't mean that, that the thing still isn't wrong. Right. If we're not careful, we don't hear what they're really trying to say. We ignore the complexity of human motivations. Okay. And we could talk forever about that. If we were in in-person class, we talk about that. There's so much complexity around human motivations, but I will tell you this, 100% of the time, human beings are working in their self-interest, and no one will change my mind on that. And again, you say, well, that's not me, JC, that's you. No, it's all of us. Okay. But some of us try to hide it, some of us try to hide it better. And then it talks about avoiding two mistakes. Number one is this, avoiding the first mistake, disentangle impact and intent. Okay. That's the first thing. And then the book talks a lot about that. And then the second mistake is listen for feelings and reflect on your own intentions. Okay. Listen past the accusations for feelings. Be open to reflecting on the complexity of your own intentions. Okay. So again, you understand they're coming to the table with intentions, but so are you. And so we've got to learn. So here's what I would recommend on this one. Always assume positive intent. I had somebody tell me that one time. It's one of the hardest things to do. Anytime you're in a conversation, anytime you're in a situation where maybe there's a lack of trust, what you can do is come into the situation and you can always assume positive intent. Okay. So here's the third thing that I want you to reflect on. What is, has there been a conversation recently where you assumed negative intent, or a situation, it could be in your personal life, professional life, whatever. And what were the negative outcomes when you assumed negative intent? Maybe you've been perfect for the last 10 years. Well, go back 15 years. Find a time in your life when you assumed negative intent and just write briefly about how that worked out for you. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to these podcasts. I hope that these add value. Again, this is soft skills training is what this is. So we can continue to get better and be better for the workplace. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.